welcome to Dollars and Donuts. Today's presentation is Tax Revenue and Economic Conditions. Today's presenter will be Jeff Robinson.
All right. Hi. Thanks, Rodrigo. Jeff Robinson, Senior Analyst for the Legislative Services Agency. In my job, I deal with the Ways and Means Committee and revenue estimating. Today's subject is tax revenue and economic conditions. Hopefully you'll find that this is useful in what you do with the legislature, and I'll feel happy about it if that's true. Anyway, we'll go with sharing of the PowerPoint presentation that I have made available. And start off with overall taxes for the state of Iowa is shown here from 2007 to the most recent year, finished year, fiscal year 2020. This is a pretty darn good representation of total state and local tax revenue collected in Iowa. The blue bars at the bottom being state taxes, and that's not just the state general fund, but it includes things like road use tax fund taxes, gambling taxes, cigarette taxes, those kind of things that aren't placed in the general fund. So it's entire state tax revenue with the refunds that are issued subtracted from the amount that's displayed there. The white bars is property tax, and which essentially 100% goes to local government, and the top sections is the local option sales taxes. A couple of local options, the school infrastructure money, the local option sales tax for local governments, and the surtax for income surtax for schools that have it. This last year, I believe, was, well, it's here at the top of this next slide. $16.392 billion is the calculation for fiscal year 2020, total state and local taxes. About 38% of that's local property taxes, 6.8% of it local option taxes, as you can see in the pie chart. Individual income taxes, 24% of our total state taxes come from individual income tax. Something to go along with that is a lot of people want to know what percentage of our taxes come from individual income tax. This is what percentage. 24% is the percentage that is of all state and local taxes. If they just want to know general fund numbers, it's a completely different percentage, a much higher percentage. I would also note that within local option, there's a little bit of surtax in there too, $100 million or so of surtax for schools. So that would also, of course, be an individual income tax. My slide 4 here is provides you with the sources of growth for over the 2008 to 2020 period. Yellow bars being growth in net state taxes. The black is the growth in local option taxes, and the bricks on top are the growth in property taxes for each one of those years. We've had 3 years during that period where essentially there was no or negative growth in overall state and local taxes, but usually a normal year, one that isn't impacted by a recession, or in the case of 2014, some tax law changes at the state and federal levels. We get 400 to 600 to even at 1 year $800 million worth of overall tax revenue growth, state and local. Switching now towards the state general fund only. This is the Revenue Estimating Conference, REC results for fiscal years 18, 19, and 20. That's our state general fund revenue. And then the latest, December 2020, REC estimates for fiscal years 21 and 22. A lot of numbers involved. Have this kind of broken down by the major taxes on the top. Income, sales, corporate, and then other taxes. There's a line for other receipts, which is things like judicial revenue, interest, and profits from the liquor or liquor profits. Things like that go into other receipts. Then we then that totals to the gross tax and other receipts. Then we have to do adjustments for accruals, refunds that are issued over the course of the year, school infrastructure, money that goes to the school districts, gives us net receipts. And total net receipts, that line is what we track in daily receipts. If you have interest and spend time with our daily receipts function on our website, that's that line, total net receipts. But the state also gets transfer money, which we keep out of daily receipts for some reasons that because it can at times throw off the receipts reporting if you include transfers in there. Add transfers on that on top of total net receipts, and you get net receipts plus transfers, which is the amount of money the general fund has in that particular year. The first 3 years, of course, is actual, and the last 2 years are projections. This gives you the year-over-year growth in revenue. You can see that for 2021, the REC projection is just basically $39 million worth of revenue growth. And 2022 gets us back to a more normal year of almost $300 million worth of growth. This chart gives you a fairly long-term history of the 12-month moving total of general fund net general fund revenue. I have 2 lines on here. The dark blue line is without transfers, and the thinner red line is with transfers. And if you give one of the reasons we don't include transfers in our daily receipts is because in certain times like economic problem years, recession years, the legislature will come in and transfer money into the general fund. And if you just looked at general fund revenue with transfers involved, it hides to some extent what happened to revenue that year, because money that's brought in from the reserve funds, for instance, would hide some of the pain that the general fund went through that year. And if you go back and you look up from June 2002 in the left half there, you can see a year where a lot of money was brought in from the reserve funds to close budget gaps that were caused by recession years. Similar thing happened, but not as much in the recession of 2008. So if you look up from June 2009, June 2010, the years separate more. A reporting that includes transfers versus one that doesn't. General fund revenue history. And it takes, this next chart takes that last blue line here and breaks it up into the major categories. Goes back to 1994. The top line is individual income tax. That's the path, the history of individual income tax on a 12-month moving total. You have 3 recessions during that period. The second line is sales and use tax. So the first thing you notice from this is that revenue from individual income tax is more volatile. It's pretty volatile, and that's because as incomes change, how much people owe in taxes changes quite a bit. The second line being sales tax isn't as volatile, and it also doesn't make up as high as a percentage of our revenue as does individual income tax. But it's not as volatile because people do continue to spend money in a similar manner, and recessions affect taxable income more than they do necessarily how people expend their money. And then the bottom 3 things, corporate taxes, other taxes, which would be bank franchise tax and insurance premium tax, and inheritance tax are down as a combination. And then other revenue, which I mentioned earlier, being judicial revenue and interest and those kind of things, bring in a small percentage compared to the other 2. Again, going back to long-term history of what percentage of the revenue comes in from individual sources. It changes over years for various reasons. Law changes make a difference if income tax rates are changed or if sales tax rates are changed. But one of the main things that affects the distribution of where our tax revenue comes from is the fact that individual income, the thing that's taxed, our income that's taxed, grows faster than does our buying of things that are subject to the sales tax. So sales tax grows slower than our income does. A lot of money we spend from what we earn goes to things that aren't subject to the sales tax. So if left by itself, individual income tax tends to grow as a percentage of our total general fund revenue sources. So we go back to 94, the first year that I have, individual income tax was 41.4. 9 years later, in 2003, it's 44.9. It jumps to 49% by 2012, and it's 50%. It's half the money for the general fund in the 12 months that ended December of 2020. But it doesn't, but if you look at the other pieces of pie, you see that it's not, I mean, what is happening with our pie is that other revenue and other taxes have shrunk considerably as a percentage of our revenue sources. Back in 94, there was a lot of institutional money was put in the general fund, and some other revenue sources that have over the years been moved out of the general fund. Interest used to be a much bigger source of general fund revenue, and it's not anymore. Interest rates are just hardly exist. And then in the other taxes category, we used to put in cigarette tax in the general fund, and we don't anymore. And we cut the insurance premium tax rate from 2% to 1%, and we used to put some gambling tax in the general fund. So that source, those other taxes have gone down from 9% of the general fund to under 4%. Other revenue has gone down from 9% of the general fund to under 4%. And that just means that those other sources that we rely on end up providing a higher percentage of the total pie. Long-term trends. The next three charts kind of go over the same thing. I'll skip over net individual revenue and sales tax and look a little bit at corporate tax. Back in the recession of the early 2000s, corporate income tax almost disappeared. Got down to like $72 million over the course of a 12-month period. And it has rebounded since then, and has rebounded. It has grown quite a bit since 2018 from our soil. We used to get $400 million net in corporate income tax, and it's now reached $700 million. And that is likely just because of better corporate profitability. In Iowa, we only tax profits on the sales within the state of Iowa for your company, for your C corporation. And so it's unlikely that sales in Iowa of all these C corporations have grown a lot. I mean, far more than our incomes. It's hard for that to happen. But if they become more profitable, the ones that are paying tax, then we would get more money. I think there's a lot more to this story that I wouldn't know, that the people, because we don't have access to corporate income tax returns. It would be a very interesting thing to know what has caused this good expansion in corporate income tax, but it's really something that only individual corporations really could know. And then moving on a little bit to the economic situation, I like to look at things as probably tell on long-term trends, and this is the long-term trend of U.S. employment, the non-farm employment series, the payroll series. This is the reports that employers send in that says how many employees they have at a particular time. And you can see up through the start of the 2001 recession, I have that red line in there that kind of indicates the slope of employment growth in the United States. And then at the green line, I want to highlight the fact that since 2001, the rate of growth of employment in the United States has fallen significantly. We've had 2 recessions since that time, a third one. I mean, actually, we're on our third one now since that time. But the overall result over those 20 years, almost 20 years, is much slower job growth than the 30 years before that. And there are reasons probably behind that. Some of those reasons go far beyond me, but one of them I'll get into in a minute is just demographics. And Iowa has exactly the same issue. Iowa's red line it looks exactly the same to me. We did have a rather massive couple of recessions in the early 80s, the farm crisis, and it kind of put us well off of the national trend at that time. But when you got right down to it, from 76 through 2000, 2001, we had a pretty good average growth rate of employment, and it has not been anywhere near that good since then. And also shows on this chart that we have the slack we have now due to the current recession. And the reason, probably one of the main reasons, maybe the reason that job growth has slowed nationally in Iowa is population growth. And what we see is, we all used to talk about the baby boom a lot 20 years ago. It doesn't get talked about as much as it used to. But the U.S. population used to grow on 1.5% to almost 2% a year. It slid during the second half of the 60s, but it's still growing 1%. We had a boomlet population growth in the 90s, and we have now slid to having a country that was only growing at 0.5% a year. And it is not so much probably that this year's growth rate as it was the growth rate 20 years ago and 30 years ago that determines whether you're going to have any ability to grow employment in the next year, or the next 2 years, the next 3 years. And this tells me a lot that our issues of employment growth over the last 20 years have a lot to do with demographics, not having enough growth in the population that would take jobs. It's a little complicated. Next slide, the federal funds rate. It is an important thing. It is an important thing with dealing with economic downturns and inflation. The black line on here is the federal funds rate, the rate established by the Federal Reserve Board for certain interest rates for borrowing between banks. It's kind of the basis of banking in the United States. And what I want to point out on here, back up just a bit. The Fed has this dual mandate of maximizing employment and essentially controlling inflation. And in this chart from 87 through 2001, that same type of time frame, our economy used to run on an inflation rate, or on a federal funds rate that was well above the rate of inflation. But that was the federal funds rate that we could use. And we can probably, many of us remember interest rates that were much higher than they are now. And it was normal for the Fed funds rate, the main controlling factor that the Federal Reserve had was to keep interest rates higher than inflation by several percentage points. And since 2000, there have been very few times where the federal funds rate was higher than the inflation rate. Before the 2008 recession, it did get above the inflation rate again. And then just briefly, in 2019, they raised interest rates enough to get above the rate of inflation. Things freaked out at that point, and they began lowering interest rates again rapidly, particularly rapidly when COVID hit. And so we're once again well below the rate of inflation with our federal funds rate. And to me, that's just 20 years of not very healthy economics. That our economy cannot withstand interest rates that are higher than the rate of inflation, which I think probably 20 years ago people would have said that would be an extremely rare instance when you would have your interest rates below the rate of inflation. And now we do it all the time. U.S. economy wage growth income, the source of wage growth in the United States, or in the population, can be estimated by multiplying employment times the hourly wage times the number of hours worked. And this is what my graph for showing what it's meant lately. The black line is the results of that. That's wage and salary employment growth, or wage and salary growth. And it's broken down into the growth in those three things. The yellow portions is the growth in employment. The reddish bars is the growth in the hourly wage. And the blue is the work week, how many hours people are working. We have three recessions represented here in the early 2000s, 2008, and the most recent one. The black line in the early 2000s recession does not go negative, but you can see where employment drops off, the work week drops off, and there's slowness in the growth in the average hourly earnings. You see the same thing in the second recession, although much steeper, and it does go negative. Overall, wage and salary growth goes negative. The first thing that happens is employment starts to fall, the work week starts to get shorter, and then the hourly wage goes down. So this particular recession over on the right, employment plummeted, the hourly work week has gone up to some extent because probably the people who are no longer working didn't work a full work week, and the average hourly wage has gone way up to a level we haven't seen in a long time. And that is, since I'm pretty certain people aren't just getting good raises that they didn't used to get, I'm pretty certain that just tells us that the people who have lost their jobs are at the low end of the wage scale. And now what's left when you calculate the average hourly wage is higher wage people. And this, to me, demonstrates that our current recession has fallen heavily on people who did not particularly make a lot of money in the first place. Iowa unemployment. This is unemployment claims. So people who were working, who lose their jobs and file an unemployment claim. You can see over on the left is this year. It's the current year. The blue line that spikes up, that's the big jump in initial unemployment claims that resulted from the shutdown and COVID-19. The red line below it is the same claims for the same week 1 year earlier. We see the big jump. We see the trending down. We see it get close to last year's level in around October. And I would say that looks really close on this graph, but if it wasn't for the giant spike above 60, they really aren't that close. I mean, we really didn't get, this gives you the indication in October, the 1010, the 1024, 1117 marks on this graph is that we almost got back to the recovery, but really there's quite a distance between those two, this year's and last year's. It's just hidden by the fact that the axis has to be so tall to incorporate the big spike on the left. Things get, because of Thanksgiving, because of Christmas, because of New Year's, things get a little strange in the weekly numbers in when the reporting week falls along with holidays. So there's spikes in this year and there's spikes in last year. This last dot, which is January of 2021, January 2nd, 2021, is not a particularly good dot. There were a lot of initial unemployment claims filed for the week ending January 2nd. Hopefully that is, again, some seasonal holiday issues, and the next one will drop, hopefully. The one that we'll get the 9th, or will be the week ending the 9th, so we'll get it next Thursday. Hopefully that will come down. Hopefully that's not an upward trend where this year is pulling away from last year. The economy should be recovering. If it's not, we may have some months or longer of pain coming as far as initial unemployment claims. Slide 18 here, I show you how Iowa employment grows compared to the U.S. employment growth. Using non-farm employment. Obviously, Iowa's economy and jobs don't grow at the same rate as the whole of the U.S. does at all times. I think what I'd highlight here, though, is that since 2013, state of Iowa's employment has grown significantly slower than the national trend. Now, this graph ends March 2020 because once COVID hit, both of those graphs shot negative, and Iowa has looked better in the negative period than the national rate of growth. But that is what happens to Iowa basically every time there's a recession that's not a farm recession. And but growing, we had gotten down to where we were slightly negative growth in March of 2020, where the national rate of growth was still over 1%. You do that for a few years and you really fall behind the rest of the economy, at least as far as employment numbers are concerned. Whereas I just put 3 of these in here to show some employment by sector. Main sectors, people like to know how manufacturing is done. I think this is on a 12-month moving average basis, I think, and therefore it doesn't really show quite as much of a shift as you would think you would show if you were looking at this month to month. This month compared to same month last year. Manufacturing, the hit to manufacturing has not been extreme. The hit to construction has been more extreme. And the hit to leisure and hospitality has been beyond extreme, I would say. And again, this probably goes back to show once again that this particular recession has been brutal to those that have lower income jobs. Assuming that leisure and hospitality is in fact lower in income jobs, and they probably are. Iowa wage and salary growth. This is a 4-quarter moving total growth, and we have on here 4 recessions, I should say. Early 90s, very little drop in the wage and salary growth in Iowa. Early 2000s, a pretty wide recession, but it still was positive growth. The 2008 recession, we went negative for 4 quarters. That was pretty sad. In this one, we've only had 2 quarters so far that would be considered part of the recession, and they haven't drugged the wage and salary growth yet below 0. And maybe after the next quarter, maybe after the quarter after that, maybe it'll go negative. But so far, from a wage and salary standpoint, the last recession was the bad one. We shall see how things recover in the next 6 months. When we talk about 4 quarters here, that's the quarter ending September of 2020 is the last one on here. One thing that explains a lot as far as tax revenue so far, why is tax revenue held up when wage and salary income is going down, and we all know that there's such upheaval in the economy, and that reason that things have not been so bad and why sales and use tax is held up is because the federal government has sent us a lot of money. And the federal people who do personal income estimates for the country sent out estimates of how much, basically the CARES Act, it's basically the CARES Act from last spring, how much that's sent to residents of each of the states, and this is Iowa's share. In the 2 quarters that we have information available for, they've sent us $7,751 million to be added to our personal income, which is about 5% of a year's personal income, has been sent out in the form of those programs that you see listed. The major one being the checks that were sent out mostly in June, and the $600 unemployment compensation number. That has allowed the economy to keep moving forward for most people. And this is just 2 quarters with. The 4th quarter will have another round of this kind of money. And then if another, because we have to add on top of that, because they have now passed another stimulus bill and I'm talking about a future one. Without this kind of money, I think we would be in serious a serious economic downturn right now. This has been holding things together. The question would remain is how much of this needs to continue to keep things going. Does the economy heal itself? Do those people get back to work and jobs, or does the debt of the United States have to continue to fill their pockets enough so that they can keep the economy going? Those are beyond me questions. I will just, enter the numbers when they give them to me in 3 months. And then finally, the final thing I'd mention is that the myth, the magic of the stock market is represented by this graph on the S&P 500. The blue line is the current year S&P 500, and the red line that's below it, basically most of the time, is where the S&P 500 was 1 year earlier. And so the blue line's about 1 year long now, and we see the giant drop of the realization of COVID-19. We have recovered to such a situation. We're up about 16 or so percentage points from a year ago in the S&P 500, which is hard for me to understand that is the economic consequences of COVID-19 is that the S&P 500 would be 16% higher than it was a year ago. But I wish I knew that beforehand. But that's the case right now. And that takes me to the end of my presentation. And I would be open. Went through a lot here. I'll try to leave things in a position where I can get back to the information if there are questions about it. Maybe I'll go to Rodrigo here and he can ask for questions.
Yeah, I'm not showing any questions in the chat box, so but if there are any other questions.
Jeff, I had one question. When you put that slide up on construction, I didn't get your comments on that one on construction.
Yeah, it's just I don't really have any particular construction comments other than in Iowa for 4 or 5 years we had done pretty well compared to the national growth in the construction employment. But we have lost. What do we look at that? 9,000 jobs. 9,000 construction jobs over those 8 months that are represented by COVID. It's not particularly a good thing, but it's not near as bad as leisure and hospitality. That's what I was trying to get across there.
So this is actual expenditures in the construction industry rather than permits and so on of what is occurring. It doesn't reflect on that.
No, what this is employment in construction industries.
Okay.
So that it's usually 80,000. It's been running at an 80,000 employee industry, and it's now 72,000.
Okay. Thank you.
Hey, Jeff, this is Sarah Tron-Garriott. Do you have a sense of whether those construction projects are broken out between commercial and residential? Because I've heard just from anecdotal evidence that residential construction is booming right now. Everybody wants to have work done on their homes, their yards, that lumber is really expensive and not very available. And so I'm just wondering if that's more in the commercial area.
That's exactly what I've heard. Just what you said, just well said. And I don't, in the data that's available, it doesn't really show, it doesn't ever have a breakdown of how many people are employed in residential. And so that's a really good question. I'm sure there's probably people out here that know on a normal year that X percent of construction is residential construction employment and X percent is commercial or industrial types of projects. And I don't even know, I have no idea which one's bigger. But I agree with exactly that assessment that residential is, I don't know if booming is the right word, but it's hardly impacted. And commercial construction may have stopped.
because I'm thinking about the issues with the supply chain too, where there's certain industries that we're providing to institutions, servicing, office buildings and schools, large institutions that have just experienced a huge reduction, and the consumer side is just, there's not enough available, and it's been such a dramatic change, and the industries just really haven't been able to pivot, and that's really taken a toll.
Yes, I think it's I have to agree with every bit of that. Yes.
And I got my second stimulus check yesterday and immediately went and cashed it. And it has made a huge difference, I know, in my personal household economy. And so that, putting money in consumers' hands, it's nice to see those charts, to see how that's propped up the economy in some ways. And I know you're probably not in the business of making recommendations about what is the most helpful to stimulate growth in certain areas. But, for me, thinking about, and I said this in the chat, and thinking about population growth being connected to employment growth, we didn't have more children because we couldn't afford them, and childcare was the thing it really hinged on. And so I'm not sure if there are certain kinds of policies that help stimulate the economy that, we've seen implemented at different times that have really helped.
Yeah, I don't have, we each have our individual, somebody gives us $1,000, what are we going to do with $1,000 things? I'm glad I'm not in a position where I know exactly what I'm going to have to do with it, because it's the next bill up. But there are many people like that. And some of it ends up in necessity. Some of it ends up in buying things that you weren't going to buy otherwise, and some of it ends up in the stock market, I suspect.
Yeah, and in terms of thinking about how folks are spending those stimulus funds, I'm just really curious to see what are they spending it on, because I know for us, we just kind of immediately absorbed it. We didn't have any special new things we were able to purchase. It just kind of helped us keep going. And I know we're in a relatively stable economic position in our household, but I know for other folks, it was really about just buying food.